My scrap pile, it grows and grows until it consumes my shop, and then I have to start using it to heat my house. But hold on, before you torch that last stack of cutoffs, I'm gonna show you 3 quick projects from these leftovers to turn into cash or a great gift. Let's go. Between my parents' house and my wife's grandma's house, I grabbed these shots of some pretty worn out knife blocks. I don't know the story behind either one, and neither probably uses them very much and don't care, but noticing that they were made out of wood and looking pretty old, I thought this would be a fun project to try. Starting with some safety glasses and white oak cutoffs from a tabletop build, I began cutting the scrap pieces into strips. I looked over a few different designs for knife blocks, but thought that this style would work the best for me. At this point, I started considering how many knives and the size of each that I was hoping that this thing could eventually hold. This is my initial layout with the strips in 2 different rows. The next step was to glue the back row together and then the front row together. To turn these 2 glue-crusted blocks into smooth parts that I could glue together again, I used my block plane to decrustify one side, and then I ran both blocks through the planer. I then also trimmed off some of the excess length. This style of knife block has cuts in each row, and then the 2 rows are glued together to make a knife block, but also to keep the knives in the neighboring row from falling out. It's important that the slots are spaced properly, some deep enough for larger knives and others shallower for smaller knives. It'll make sense in a few minutes. I didn't take precise measurements for the layout, but the spacing needs to be realistic so that the knives aren't hitting each other, or you don't want to leave large gaps that just look weird. I started with slots that lined up in each row for larger knives, and then I grabbed a few knives to help visualize the spacing needed between each cut and help determine how deep each slot should be for the type of knives that would go into them. The first block got finished with large cuts for bigger knives. The second block got the 2 cuts that lined up with the first block, and then I flipped it over and cut equal sized slots on the other side for medium sized knives. With all the knife slots cut, gluing the 2 rows together needed to happen next. I wanted a good amount of glue to make this block nice and solid, but this knife block wouldn't work very well if you fill these slots full of glue. I used a thin piece of cutoff to clean out any glue that may have squeezed into each of the knife slots. With the first and the second rows glued together, I trimmed them to the same length. I am a very visual person, so the best way for me to test the angle I wanted cut on the bottom of this block was to do a few test cuts and then to see which one I liked. I think I ended up at 10 degrees. My miter saw almost made this cut. I had to trim one corner with the pull saw. Next, this block got some rounding corners to remove the sharp edges. To add the very last row, which will go up front, I glued together more strips. I cleaned up that block, and then I put the same 10-degree angle cut on the bottom. I need to make the cuts in here for smaller knives. This last row will have 6 evenly spaced slots for smaller knives. I started with 1 cut on each side of this row from each direction without moving the fence, and then I brought the fence in for the next 2 cuts doing the same, and then 1 more fence adjustment for the final 2 cuts. I was worried about not using a dowel or domino to keep this last row from sliding out of place when applying pressure with the clamps. I was careful and I made sure to keep the same slight reveal on each side, and it worked out. After letting this Titebond 3 dry overnight, I took the block out of the clamps for the final time and I gave it a sanding and added finish. This was a Christmas present for my parents, and of course I didn't get any beauty shots of it before giving it to them. Here it is on their counter on Christmas Day. And here it is when I stole it back from them to get some pictures. Make sure you keep watching. You don't want to miss the next 2 projects. I love making cutting boards. Sometimes you just need something small, quick, and easy to grab. That's why I built this one with a handle. It adds flexibility. It's a cutting surface for light prep work, but it doubles as a serving experience when you bring it to the table. For the design, I started with this mess up that I turned into a template for size inspiration, but really let's see where these scrap pieces take us. This long piece of ash will go down the center and serve as a handle. The main board section will be cherry with some sapele, padauk for an accent. To glue boards together, they need to be joined at a 90-degree angle and they need to be flat. I started by jointing each piece and then cutting them down to size. A bandsaw is great for making these cuts on smaller pieces. It's safer and it wastes less material than a table saw because the blade is thinner. I wasn't worried about that with the cherry, and the table saw will make a cleaner cut, at least for how my tools are set up. I made sure each joint was flat, and I clamped the pieces together with Tight Bond 3. With the board glued up, I found myself a bit stumped on how I wanted to shape it. The curves in the handle and each set moving forward makes such a big difference on the final look and style. To get started, the ends needed to be squared up with the handle. Then I moved to the spindle sander. After shaping it on the spindle sander, I could finally visualize how I wanted the board to look when completed. Next, I marked out the center. I then picked out a Forstner bit that looked lonely and hadn't been out in a while, and I used that in the drill press to drill a nice hole right in the handle. From there, I found a washer that looked like the right size, and I marked out the final handle size, and then I used it to mark where the corners would be rounded to. From here, I just needed to sand down to my lines the best that I could. Sanding each face of this board, I sanded my pencil lines away twice with 80 grit. I thought there may have been some planar lines in the cherry, but the pencil line sanded away both times and the lines stayed. I may have started back with 60 or 80 grit, but this is a board that we plan on keeping for ourselves. This cutting board, with its roundness and its design, definitely called for roundovers for an edge profile. I've gotten a few comments about some of the red or green tools that I have. This router table I got used, and just like all the other big tools that I have, I saved up for it by selling things that I made. As this board neared completion, I realized that I really like how the design turned out, so I decided to make a template. I didn't copy it exactly because I thought the round tip at the end of the handle could be a little bit bigger in proportion with the board, so I made that adjustment. Then, as a Christmas present to myself, I upgraded the cutter head on my jointer and I wanted to test it out. We also had a friend with a birthday coming up, so I made another one of these boards, this time with ash, purple heart, and walnut. Now with 2 boards almost done, it was time for a final sanding and then mineral oil. After a couple of coats of oil, they got the homemade treatment of mineral oil and beeswax. With that project done, I did save the best one for last. It's really fun to build things to sit on, sit at, or just to set drinks on. On my last project video, I made a stool off of a stool sample. This time I don't have a sample, and it will be a completely different style. This time I'm going to use 2 of these live edge boards that I bought back when I did a lot of epoxy charcuterie boards. One of them already has a knot filled with epoxy. My plan for this build is to go for more of a rustic look than I normally go for, and I'm going to leave the live edge on one side of the stool. When I bought these boards, they came only skip planed, so I planed them smooth with my nice helical cutter head, and then I ripped the back edge and the 2 sides smooth and square. Using my track saw is my preferred method. It's quick for me to set up, and the dust collection is good, and the cut quality is superb. Next, I measured and found the middle of this board and made this cut with my small table saw sled. This was easy with the backside already cut, and I could center my blade on the center of the mark on the board. The cut didn't end up being perfect when I set the 2 halves together, so I set up a quick fence using a stop block here. I then trimmed both boards so they were the same size. I found a live edge cutoff that was spalted and sun bleached that I'd saved for way too long. This piece I'm going to use to connect the 2 sides together. I resawed it into 2 pieces and flattened the bottom with a jointer plane. These pieces will be stretchers to hold the legs together. For the joinery on the stool, I'm going to create half lap joints. This is an easy joint, but the challenge will be that these live edge pieces are obviously different sizes on each side. I started by marking the centers of the 2 side pieces or legs. Then I figured out how wide I wanted the base to be, and I made corresponding marks on the 2 stretchers. Next, I cut the half lap joints on the stretchers, making each cut half the depth of the stretcher at that point. I used a spacer block to keep the live edge stretcher secure for a 90-degree cut and to keep everything safe. Instead of precisely measuring the width of the joints, I cut until I was close, and then I test fit to ensure a reasonably tight fit. For these half lap joints, I want a 1/2 inch reveal underneath. So I have a 2.5 inch piece of material here. I want this depth and this depth to add up to 3 inches to leave the 1/2 inch at the bottom. For the top, I need this depth to equal the 2 half lap cuts. So that way it'll be flat. Top of the stool will sit flush. With the joinery finished, I moved on to sanding each piece. Having a nice sander is one of the biggest luxuries in my shop. Selling things I made really made it possible to afford it. Using a foam pad to sand live edges or rounded pieces is also a great option for situations like sanding this live edge. Gluing this all together was pretty straightforward. The tough part was keeping the glue from squeezing out and getting into some tight areas. It took a little chisel work to clean up, and then I even had to remove some more that I missed after the finish went on, and then I had to re-add a little finish before I was finally done with the stool. Figure 8 fasteners were a good option to use to install the top. They provide a little movement side to side for when the grain expands and contracts on the top. To install them, I picked out the locations and then drilled a hole to countersink them with a Forstner bit. To make sure they fit and to allow for movement, I removed some more material with a chisel. With the sanding done and the top connected, the finish was ready to go on. I buffed it on and then wiped it off per the instructions. This is always one of the most satisfying steps. Beautiful wood, sanded correctly with oil on it, never disappoints. I do like the contrast that the epoxy-filled crack and knot gives. I may have gone with the less color on that for this particular stool, but it will do. To finish installing the figure 8 fasteners, I needed to drill a few holes and add all the screws. Then flipping this thing over and it is done. There you go, 3 quick, easy projects to use up some scrap wood. Thank you so much for watching. I'll link another one here, and I'll see you on the next one.